Me and my friends were dumb teenagers who liked to do anything for entertainment. We were playing a classic game of truth or dare. Most of the dares were mediocre. Things like ding-dong ditching and prank calls. One of my friends asked me, truth or dare? I picked dare, because the game was becoming a little boring. My friends smirked at each other, then dared me to go into the abandoned mall. The abandoned mall was pretty famous in our town. Everyone said it was haunted. It was rumored that if you went into the mall, you would never come out. No one knew who owned it or why it was abandoned, but the city just pretended like it didn't exist. That didn't stop dumb kids like us from breaking in and having fun. We drove up to the abandoned mall and I got out the car. I looked into the car window while I walked out, and I saw all of them laughing at me. I told myself I only had to make it 20 minutes. How bad can it be? I walked into the mall with confidence, but it quickly faded into the dark halls. Everything about that place just gave me the chills. There were lots of disfigured but realistic mannequins, broken store windows, and the mall was almost completely pitch black, except for the moon peering in from the ceiling windows. I stood in front of a store window with old TVs. It felt weird seeing my own reflection in the television screens. I froze when I heard a creepy song start to play. I quickly realized it was coming from the mall speakers. The place had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, so someone had to be manually playing the music. As I stared at the speaker on the ceiling, I realized I never heard that song before. I knew one thing for sure though. There was something else in the mall with me. One look at my phone told me I had 10 minutes left. I wanted to have a good story to tell my friends later, so I went to the mall's office to see who was playing the music. The closer I got, the louder the music became. I peered into the small glass window on the door. I saw a man sitting there, with his back turned to me. I almost knocked on the door, before I caught a whiff of how bad he smelled. I stared at him to see what he was doing, but suddenly he turned around. Even in the darkness, I knew he was staring straight at me. He almost didn't look human. While I was frozen in fear, he stood up. He was over 6 feet tall, towering over me. I hit the wall while backing up. I held in my screaming as I ran away. My adrenaline kicked in, and I was almost at the front door in less than a minute. I tried to open the doors, but they had been locked. At this point, I was pretty much panicking. No thoughts ran in my head other than get out. I sprinted into a nearby store and hid underneath the counter. The music stopped playing, and I almost felt relieved. But now that it was silent, I could hear footsteps getting closer to me. I sat there with my hands over my mouth, trying to muffle my breathing. I could hear him dragging something as he walked closer. I heard silence, and I peeked my head out from behind the counter. There was no one there. I was about to stand up, before I heard a voice whisper from behind me. "Found you."
My parents divorced. My mother left the house and disappeared. A few years later, my father married my stepmother. She was a very beautiful person and sweet as an angel to me. Being that she worked as a nurse, she used to take care of me whenever I got sick. I started to open up to her, and it seemed like we were becoming a real family. Until an incident happened. About 1 year later, I started to get sick. It was weird. I could feel my body was getting weaker and weaker. As always, my stepmother took care of me with all of her heart. However, something felt different. Sitting next to me while I was laying in bed, she took something out of her bag. The first thing that caught my eye was a syringe. She said she would inject me with a tonic to get better soon. To this day, I get goosebumps whenever I think of what she said, and how she said it with a smile.
"I am an angel, and I'll send you to heaven. You won't hurt anymore."
After hearing that, I refused it because it felt really weird. She then kept saying it was okay and even forcibly tried to give me the injection.
You need a shot now!
Being scared, I kept saying I didn't want it. I eventually jumped up from the bed and ran away. She then shouted loudly from behind, chasing me with a syringe in her hand.
You can't go to heaven if you reject it like this.
I ran away screaming like crazy. Ah! Just then, my father came into my room when he heard my scream and shouted at her. She screamed and rushed at him.
It's time for you to leave too.
She then put the needle in his throat. However, he managed to block her and knock her to the floor just before she injected it into his body. Later, my father immediately called the police and she was arrested at the scene. Being terrified, there was nothing I could do but just flop on the floor. It turned out that she tried to inject us with a drug that kills people. The cops told me that if I had taken the shot, I'd probably be dead by now. The investigation found that she was suffering from severe depression and mental illness. Also, it turned out that she had been putting poison in the food which I ate over the past few weeks. In other words, I was dying slowly. I eventually recovered after the treatment, but I still suffer from the fear of that day. I'm sure you're all curious at this point. What could be the reason she tried to kill me? Well, I'm the one who's most curious about that reason. All I could say is that when she was taken away that day, she stared at me and hummed a song with a freakish, chilling smile.
Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door.
I married my wife 4 years ago, and we finally moved into our dream house this year. It's a rustic home that's over 150 years old and on the very edge of town, but still within walking distance to everything we need. At some point, my wife had been convinced that our house was haunted. She kept telling me she heard voices when she was in the basement. I went down there with a baseball bat just in case someone was hiding down there. However, no one was there. Our friends started to worry about her mental health, as she kept telling them about the voices she heard in every room in the house. I ended up bringing her to a doctor, but he couldn't find anything physically wrong with her. Then I asked a local priest to come over to our house and give it a blessing, and he agreed. My wife seemed much more relaxed after he left. She claimed the voices stopped, but she still didn't like to be left alone in the house. One day, I had a business trip to attend, and that would mean I was away for the week. I asked my wife to invite one of our friends to spend the week with her, but she refused, saying that she no longer heard the voices. After the trip, I came home, and to my horror, I found my wife's body hanging from the banister. She had written a note saying that the voices wouldn't stop. I immediately called an ambulance and they arrived within minutes. Of course, she didn't make it. All of my friends and family gave me sympathetic looks at the funeral, as they knew how crazy my wife was at that time. However, it was all right. After the funeral, my girlfriend helped me remove the hidden speakers as we prepared to start our new life together.
It was a beautiful day in August. My family and I had just finished packing for our trip. We were bored and hadn't planned to do anything because our trip was in a couple of days. So we all decided to go to the safari zoo place because it was only an hour drive and a great way to kill time. When we got there and we noticed that there were a bunch of people at the zoo, my family could get impatient of this, so we asked the receptionist if there was anything we could do that wasn't too busy. Lucky for us, there were private tours. They were a bit expensive, but the lady assured us that the tour guides were highly educated and great at their job. We were given animal food and introduced to our private tour guide. When we first saw our tour guide, we noticed he was a little off. He had a weird lisp didn't speak very much English and had a really bad lazy eye. When my dad first tried to greet him, he ignored my dad and gestured us to one of the safari minivans. We were a little taken aback, but didn't think anything of it. Once we got into the van, we noticed that there was a bad smell and a bunch of animal food on the floor. He started driving before we could get our seatbelts on. We first passed by lions and hyenas. It was all really cool. There were also a bunch of vans and tour buses behind and in front of us that were taking all the attention of the animals. Out of the blue, the tour guide turned onto a trail that no other buses or vans were going on. My dad got a little suspicious and asked the tour guide where we were going. The tour guide replied with elephants, shortly because once again he didn't know English very well. Well, we really wanted to see the elephants at that time, so we all got excited. After a good 10 minutes of driving, we noticed that we had seen no animals and no other tour guides, just a never-ending forest. My mom, who has paranoia, was getting worried and repeatedly asked the tour guide where he was going. But then, he never answered. All of a sudden, he stopped the car and said he had to get something from the back of his car. My dad was getting red flags and watched him from the rearview mirror. And then, my dad hopped into the driver's seat, locked all the doors immediately, and pressed the accelerator to the floor. With a fearful face that I've never seen before like that, we were all slammed into the backs of our seats. "What's going on?" my mom yelled. "I saw him holding an axe," my dad yelled back. We made it back to the safari and to the receptionist. We explained the whole situation and she called the police. They had a long search and finally he got caught after a few hours. We got a full refund and later found out that our tour guide didn't even work at the safari but used a fake ID and had history linked with murder, kidnapping, and other crimes we won't mention. We also found out the reason that the car smelled so bad was because the tour guide admitted to killing multiple safari animals and taking them home. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if my dad didn't look in the rearview mirror when the tour guide stopped the car.
My name is Eric. I'm 31 years old, as well as a single dad living in a one-story house with my son, named Alex. It all started the night before Christmas, when Alex was 5 years old. Alex was so excited, so we decided to go for a walk around our town. We were walking down our road listening to the sound of carolers in the distance. That led us all the way down to the main street. When we came face to face with the three old women singing, I took out my phone trying to record a story for my Instagram, just like other people around us. When I looked down, I saw my son covering his ears. I stopped recording, crouched down, and asked him what was wrong, but he didn't answer. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the middle woman of the three carolers was giving my son an evil grin with a large, creepy smile. She seemed a little bit weird. Well, it was a chilly December night, so I decided we would head back anyway. When we reached home, my son looked relieved. So I thought he just wanted to go watch TV and catch up on his episode he thought that he might miss. Later, as I was cooking in the kitchen, I took a glance at my son, and I could see that he looked absolutely terrified. He was sitting straight up on the couch, which faced the TV. There was a large window next to the couch that had the curtains slightly open. Then he sprinted up quickly, ran to me, and just hugged my leg. "Daddy, she's here," he told me with a shivering voice, and I replied, "Who?" He exclaimed back, "The middle woman we saw when we watched the caroling." I quickly looked at the window, and there really was that old lady we saw not too long ago. I closed my eyes for about 1 second, and when I opened my eyes again, she completely vanished. Being freaked out, I called 911 naturally, telling them about what had just happened. There were 3 cops that showed up, so I explained the incident to them again, and one of the cops showed me a photograph that looked kind of old to me. She was in there. Then she pointed to that old lady, asking if this was her, and I answered yes. She started laughing. My son looked confused until I asked why she was laughing. She stopped and gave us a kind of serious look this time, but was still smiling. Then she said, "Hey, you know what? I know this is weird, but this woman died 3 years ago, on this exact same day." My heart dropped. That's when my son looked terrified too. I tried to calm him down, but I couldn't believe what was going on. The other 2 cops came inside and said they found no trace of anything while searching. It made no sense. When the cops had left our house, I put my son into his bed and went to my room. I turned the light on my nightstand that was close to the side, grabbed my phone, and decided to check Instagram, thinking that if I could find anything, I would just call the cops back. I opened my story, and to my surprise, I couldn't find that old lady in there. I checked another story, and then checked another again. But in fact, it was just 2 women there singing. Feeling mixed emotions like scared, mad, and even more, stupid, I started checking some other people's stories from around my neighborhood. And still, she wasn't there. But all of a sudden, I realized something. When I was checking some story feeds, I ran into one story of some woman who was standing right next to me during the caroling. Where my son and I should have been standing was replaced by nothing. It was like we weren't even there from the beginning. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. I put a hand over my mouth and couldn't say anything. That night, that Christmas day became the most terrible moment for us. Well, I'm 33 now, and my son is now 7 years old. But even if everybody thinks that it doesn't sound true at all, we both still remember it like it was yesterday.
When I was around 14 years old, I always went on the internet, and I had this app called Discord. After a while of having Discord, I met a boy named Luke. We started talking for a while, and one day, he asked me what I looked like. Without thinking, I sent him a picture of me. He told me that I was beautiful and that he loved my long dark hair and how I did my eyeliner. I just said thanks, thinking nothing of it. Around a week later, he told me that he loved me, and I felt the same way about him. We had so much in common. Luke was very good-looking too. He had a different style from normal people. He wore a mask and always wore the color black. A while later, I realized it started becoming too much for me. He would always ask me personal questions like where I lived, and I told him I lived in California. He also lived in California and said he wanted to run away and meet me. He said that our relationship was going to get real. We kept talking every day, and he got so overprotective and would text me every few minutes. One day, I was home alone because my parents were on a trip to celebrate their 20th anniversary. I didn't mind until it became nighttime. It was so dark outside, and it gave me the chills. I decided to close all the windows and make sure that the doors were locked. I sat in my living room and watched some TV. After around 20 minutes, I heard a knocking sound coming from the window behind me. I realized I didn't pull the blinds over it and that some kids were probably playing tricks on me. I got up and went to the window. As I got closer, my heart kept beating faster and faster. I looked out the window and no one was there. So I just closed it with the blinds and sat back down. After that, I got a message from Luke. He said, "Let's meet up now." I told him I was busy and that I couldn't, but he said that I wasn't and that he could see me. I felt so afraid and told him to stop scaring me because I was home alone, which I really shouldn't have told him. I asked him how he knew where I lived, and he told me that he looked on Snapchat and found my exact location so he could meet up with me whenever he wanted. I was so afraid. I heard a knock on the door, and a teen boy's voice tell me to open the door. It sounded so attractive, and I knew that it had to be Luke. I stayed still and didn't know what to do. I was home alone, and no one could defend me when I'm alone. I texted him and told him to leave me alone now. Luke knocked again and said he wasn't going to leave. I finally got up and opened the door. There he was, standing there, ever so tall. He smiled and bit his lip and invited himself in. I told him several times to leave, but he didn't listen. Then he went quiet, and I tapped his back. He ripped his mask off to reveal all the scars he had around his lips. I froze in shock and told him to please leave, now. I was so angry, I didn't even care. Then he smiled creepily and ran downstairs to the kitchen, and I ran after him. He was holding a knife and then ran after me. I ran outside, hid in the bushes, and called 911 as fast as I could. The police arrived quickly. They found him. But what was even more creepy was that he smirked at me when they took him into their car. I called my parents shortly after and told them everything, and they came home. I never want to stay home alone again. It creeps me out. I deleted Discord and blocked him before I did. Having an internet boyfriend will haunt me forever, and I will never forget the creepy smirk he gave me.
Ever since my childhood, I've had my dream wedding all planned out. I knew what food I wanted, and I knew exactly the color scheme I wanted to use. My entire family always made fun of me for this, especially my older sister, Michelle. A couple of years ago, I met my now fiancé, let's call him Steve, and fell madly in love with him. And now we are planning on having our wedding in a couple of months. We both decided that we wanted a child-free wedding, as those are just more enjoyable. Most of the people I invited were very understanding about this and arranged to organize babysitters so that they could attend. Everything seemed just perfect until I explained this situation to Michelle. She immediately threw a hissy fit and said there was no way in hell she was leaving her child at home. She rallied all of our family, and they all threatened not to attend if she wasn't allowed to bring her child. Steve tried his best to console me, as he knew that I was heartbroken at having my dream wedding ruined. We tried to arrange alternative ideas for Michelle, where she could bring her child to the reception, but not to the wedding itself. She screamed at me and called me an uncaring monster, while I sat there crying. She kept telling me that she would not leave her newborn child at home, that I had no choice but to agree to her demands. She then finished her drink before looking me in the eye and calling me a worthless piece of shit. I knew that I had made the right decision after this exchange. I did feel a pang of guilt as I watched her weeping in the hospital, but slipping the abortion pills into her drink had been the one way to achieve my dream wedding.
There was a famous man in a restaurant called Milan in New York, who always suddenly appeared and told strange stories to customers that they had never heard of. When he was out of sight, the customers began to talk about that man. However, no one could remember his face and even the stories that they'd been hearing from him.
My parents had planned a nice, relaxing trip out of the country for themselves. That left my dog and I home alone for an entire week. As they pulled out of the driveway, my dog and I waved them off. I had expected nothing more than to have a boring week house sitting. After we went back inside, the two of us spent the morning binge watching random movies. Time seemed to go by quickly when immersed in watching TV. And after about the fifth one, I realized how quickly it got dark outside. I came to the decision of going to my room to sleep, and expected my dog to follow. Instead, he sat in front of the back door waiting to be let out. I grabbed some slippers and a jacket, then opened the door and stood outside, as I waited for him to finish his business. It was exceptionally chilly outside, which formed goosebumps in my arms. I could hear trees rustling, but I had just assumed it was because of the windy night. My backyard had a fence, but it was short enough to the point where I could see on the other side. In the distance, there was a dark figure peeking from behind a tree. I stood there frozen, and swore we had made eye contact. Luckily, my dog was ready to go inside, so I had pretended like I hadn't seen anything, and locked the door as soon as we entered. I took a seat back on the couch, my dog jumping to sit next to me. Trying to forget what I saw outside, I turned on the TV and flipped to the news station.
Breaking news. It's been reported that a serial killer is on the loose. Please be sure to lock your doors and stay inside until further notice.
Sweat dripped down my face, and I quickly turned the TV off. That man standing out there with a serial killer on the loose, that was no coincidence. This was fate. My dog started to whimper as he realized something was wrong, and I was debating my options. Do I run outside and take the risk? Or do I hide upstairs and wait for the person to leave? I sat hidden behind the couch and saw a figure through the blinds on the back door. My heart raced as I heard the doorknob jiggling. They definitely knew I was inside. I ran upstairs with my dog in an attempt to hide. We hid in the closet of my room. Even though it was on a completely different floor, I could hear the exact moment the back door was forced open. Once they were inside the house, they took no time in looking for me. The footsteps up the stairs seemed to take forever. They walked loudly, almost as if they wanted me to know they were approaching. Once the footsteps stopped, I could tell they were in front of my door, and it slowly creaked open. The closet's blinds let me peek through to see what was happening. I watched them look under my bed, peek behind my door, until they finally stopped in front of my closet. Before they could open it themselves, I made the first move. The house was all mine for the week, so the pros seemed to outweigh the cons. The smell of fresh blood entered my lungs. The serial killer mentioned on the loose was me, but no matter how many times you warn people, some just aren't careful enough.
This happened to me while I was on my way home one night. I was living in an apartment at the time. When I arrived on the first floor of my building, there was a piece of paper hanging on the wall that said that the elevator was out of service. No, not again, I said to myself. I lived on a pretty high floor, so without any other choice, I had to walk up the stairs. I was walking up the stairs out of sheer desperation, and all of a sudden, I heard something. Then I began to feel uneasy. I knew that crimes often occurred around my neighborhood, especially targeting people who were alone. When I listened closely, I could hear a pair of men's shoes and a pair of women's high heels walking at the same time. I assumed that it was a couple. You guys are having a hard time like me. I'm struggling to walk up the stairs, especially this late at night. I thought to myself. I sighed with relief and turned my head around. However, I will never forget what I saw at that moment. There was a man who was crawling with a pair of men's shoes on his feet and a pair of high heels on his hands. He was crawling towards me.